Simone de Beauvoir begins her philosophy by confronting one of the oldest and most deeply rooted structures in human society, the way human beings transform other human beings into objects, into secondary existences defined not by their own freedom, but by the expectations, desires, and systems surrounding them. And from this starting point, her thought unfolds into a profound exploration of freedom, identity, gender, power, responsibility, and the difficult struggle required to live authentically within a world that constantly pressures individuals to become fixed roles instead of fully conscious beings. At the center of her philosophy lies the belief that human existence is fundamentally open, unfinished, and uncertain. No person enters the world carrying a predetermined essence that dictates who they must become. Human beings first exist and only afterward shape themselves through choices, actions, relationships, and projects. And because of this openness, freedom becomes unavoidable. Individuals may try to escape it, deny it, or hide from it behind social conventions and fixed identities, but they can never completely remove themselves from the responsibility of choosing what kind of life they will live. Yet this freedom is not experienced equally by everyone. She sees that societies create structures that encourage some individuals to act as subjects, as active creators of meaning and history, while pushing others into the position of objects, beings defined from the outside rather than through their own self-determination. And nowhere does she see this more clearly than in the historical condition of women, who for centuries were not treated as fully autonomous individuals, but as extensions of male existence, valued according to usefulness, beauty, obedience, reproduction, or emotional support rather than recognized as complete human beings in their own right. This leads her toward one of her most famous and revolutionary insights, that woman is not born but becomes woman, meaning that femininity is not simply a natural biological destiny, but a social construction built through expectations, education, customs, myths, and institutions that shape girls from childhood into specific roles and behaviors, gradually teaching them to internalize limitations that appear natural only because they have been repeated for generations. She becomes deeply interested in the way societies create myths around femininity, turning women into symbolic figures rather than allowing them to exist as complex individuals. Women become mothers, muses, temptresses, caretakers, ideals of purity, objects of desire. But in all these forms, they are often defined relative to men rather than as independent centers of consciousness. And this process transforms them into what she calls the other, a being positioned as secondary, different, and dependent, while man is treated as the neutral standard of humanity itself. What disturbs her most is that this condition often becomes psychologically internalized. Oppression does not survive through force alone, but through habits, emotional expectations, economic dependence, and social conditioning that shape how individuals perceive themselves. And over time, many begin accepting imposed limitations as natural truths, losing sight of possibilities they were never encouraged to imagine. In this way, domination reproduces itself not only externally through institutions, but internally through consciousness itself. At the same time, she refuses to reduce individuals entirely to victims of circumstance, because existential freedom remains central to her thought. Even within oppressive conditions, human beings retain some capacity for transcendence, the ability to move beyond given situations through action, reflection, creativity, and resistance. And this tension between freedom and limitation becomes one of the defining features of her philosophy, because she understands that human beings are always both constrained and free at once, shaped by circumstances yet never fully determined by them. She criticizes forms of thinking that reduce people to fixed essences, because such thinking denies the fluid and evolving nature of existence itself. Human beings are not static objects, but living consciousnesses constantly projecting themselves toward possibilities, constantly becoming rather than simply being. And any society that traps individuals within rigid identities suffocates this movement, reducing existence into repetition instead of open becoming. Her philosophy, therefore, becomes a defense of ambiguity, the recognition that human life can never be perfectly stable, complete, or certain. Individuals long for fixed identities because uncertainty is frightening. Yet genuine existence requires accepting instability and contradiction rather than escaping into comforting illusions. Freedom itself is ambiguous because it offers possibility while also burdening individuals with responsibility, anxiety, and the risk of failure. She sees many people attempting to escape this burden by retreating into what existentialists call bad faith, a form of self-deception where individuals deny their freedom by pretending they're merely fixed things, powerless products of destiny, biology, society, or role. A person hides behind labels, routines, or expectations to avoid confronting the unsettling reality that they must continuously choose themselves. And this escape may provide temporary comfort, but ultimately leads to a diminished and inauthentic existence. Relationships between human beings become especially complex within this framework because every consciousness desires both freedom and recognition. People want to affirm themselves as autonomous subjects while also being acknowledged by others. Yet this creates tension because individuals can easily begin treating one another as objects rather than respecting each other's freedom fully. Love, desire, friendship, and social life therefore become arenas of struggle where domination and liberation constantly intermingle. She is particularly critical of romantic myths that encourage women to dissolve themselves completely into relationships, sacrificing their own projects and identities in order to exist through another person, because such surrender destroys reciprocity. Genuine love, for her, can exist only between two free individuals who recognize and support one another's transcendence rather than reducing each other into possession or dependency. Work and economic independence also become essential to liberation because individuals who lack material autonomy often struggle to exercise freedom meaningfully. Dependence creates vulnerability, forcing people to organize their lives around survival within systems controlled by others. And this is why she views social and economic structures as inseparable from existential questions. Freedom cannot remain purely abstract. It must become livable within concrete conditions. Yet despite her critique of oppression, she does not believe liberation means escaping all limitations entirely, because human existence itself is rooted in limitation. People are embodied beings living within time, mortality, history, and social realities they did not choose. The goal is not to become infinitely free, but to create conditions where individuals can pursue meaningful projects and participate actively in shaping their lives rather than being reduced into passive objects shaped entirely by external forces. As her thought deepens, she increasingly sees ethics not as obedience to universal rules, but as the difficult task of willing both one's own freedom and the freedom of others simultaneously, because freedom isolated from others easily turns into domination, while genuine ethical existence requires recognizing that one's humanity is bound together with the humanity of other people. And therefore, any system that denies freedom to some ultimately damages the humanity of all. Underneath, everything runs her refusal to accept passive existence. She believes human life gains meaning through engagement, through projects, creation, struggle, relationships, and participation in the world despite uncertainty and imperfection. And while existence contains suffering, conflict, and ambiguity, these do not invalidate life. They are the very conditions through which freedom becomes real, through which individuals continuously shape themselves within a world that never offers final certainty or completion. As her philosophy continues unfolding, she turns more deeply toward the tension between freedom and situation, recognizing that no human being exists as a completely isolated consciousness floating above the world, because every person is born into conditions they did not choose: a body, a history, a society, a language, an economic reality, a network of expectations already waiting for them before they are even capable of understanding themselves. And yet, despite these limitations, individuals still remain responsible for how they respond to what has been given to them. And this difficult balance becomes central to her understanding of existence itself. She rejects simplistic ideas of freedom that ignore material and social realities, because such ideas often become privileges disguised as universal truths. It is easy, she believes, to speak abstractly about freedom while ignoring the concrete structures that restrict people's possibilities. And this is why she insists that philosophy must remain connected to lived experience rather than retreating into detached abstraction. Human beings do not experience existence in theory. They experience it through daily life, through relationships, labor, sexuality, aging, vulnerability, fear, desire, and social pressure. And any philosophy that ignores these realities risks becoming empty. Her analysis of oppression, therefore, becomes deeply psychological as well as political. She sees that domination functions not only through laws and institutions, but through imagination itself, shaping how individuals perceive what is possible for them. And when someone is repeatedly treated as secondary, dependent, weak, emotional, or inferior, these expectations slowly enter consciousness, influencing behavior and limiting ambition long before direct force becomes necessary. In this way, social structures reproduce themselves internally through habits of thought and feeling. She notices how girls are often taught from an early age to become objects for others, encouraged to monitor their appearance, behavior, desirability, and social acceptability constantly, learning to view themselves through external eyes rather than developing themselves freely as autonomous subjects. Their value becomes tied to approval, beauty, or relational usefulness. And this training creates a divided consciousness where many struggle to experience themselves directly because they are continuously imagining how they appear to others. For her, this division produces a profound alienation. Instead of moving naturally outward into the world through projects and action, individuals trapped within objectification become excessively self-conscious, hesitant, restricted by the awareness of being watched and judged, and this interrupts the spontaneous movement of freedom itself, narrowing existence into performance rather than genuine participation. At the same time, she understands that oppression creates complicated emotional attachments because systems of domination often provide forms of security alongside limitation. Dependence can feel safer than freedom because freedom requires uncertainty, risk, and responsibility, while fixed roles offer stability and recognition. Many individuals therefore experience an internal conflict where they simultaneously desire liberation and fear it, wanting independence while also longing for the comfort of predefined identities. This insight leads her toward a broader understanding of bad faith. People do not deceive themselves only individually, but collectively. Entire societies participate in maintaining illusions that protect existing structures from scrutiny, pretending inequalities are natural, eternal, or biologically inevitable rather than historically constructed arrangements sustained through repetition and power. These myths simplify reality because confronting ambiguity directly is exhausting. It is easier to believe roles are fixed than to accept that human existence remains fundamentally open and unstable. She becomes increasingly concerned with the way modern societies encourage passive consumption instead of active transcendence. Individuals are often pushed toward lives centered around repetition, comfort, entertainment, and routine rather than creativity and meaningful engagement. And while these forms of life may appear stable externally, they often conceal a quiet emptiness beneath the surface, a feeling that existence is happening mechanically rather than consciously. For her, transcendence means more than ambition or success. It refers to the human movement beyond immediate conditions through projects, imagination, action, and creation. A person becomes fully alive not by remaining enclosed within passive existence, but by reaching outward toward possibilities that transform both self and world. And when societies systematically deny certain groups access to transcendence, reducing them primarily to service, reproduction, or maintenance of life, they diminish human potential itself. She also reflects deeply on the body, rejecting philosophies that treat consciousness as detached from physical existence, because human beings experience the world through embodiment. The body is not merely an object, but the lived center of experience. The way individuals encounter space, desire, vulnerability, pleasure, and limitation. And yet societies often transform bodies into sites of control and judgment, especially the bodies of women, which become heavily regulated through beauty standards, moral expectations, reproductive roles, and cultural fantasies. Aging becomes another important theme because it exposes how societies value people conditionally according to productivity, attractiveness, or social function. She sees old age not simply as a biological process, but as a social condition shaped by exclusion and invisibility, where individuals gradually become marginalized within cultures obsessed with youth, efficiency, and forward movement. The elderly remain conscious subjects with desires, memories, and inner lives. Yet society increasingly treats them as if they have already partially disappeared from meaningful existence. Mortality itself quietly shadows all her philosophy because human freedom unfolds within finite time. Individuals never possess unlimited possibilities. Every choice excludes others. Every life moves toward death. Yet rather than making existence meaningless, this finitude gives human action urgency and seriousness because moments cannot be endlessly postponed. Meaning emerges precisely because life remains incomplete and temporary. Her ethics therefore rejects absolute moral systems detached from concrete situations. She does not believe morality can consist merely of following rigid universal rules because real human life is too ambiguous and complex for simple formulas. Ethical existence requires constant judgment, sensitivity to context, and awareness of how one's actions affect the freedom of others. And this makes morality difficult because there are rarely perfect choices untouched by conflict or contradiction. Still, she insists that ambiguity must not become an excuse for passivity or nihilism. The absence of absolute certainty does not free individuals from responsibility. On the contrary, it deepens responsibility because people must act without guarantees, creating meaning through commitment rather than discovering ready-made answers handed down from outside existence. She admires individuals who embrace this difficulty honestly, who act creatively within imperfect conditions rather than retreating into resignation or cynicism, because she sees authentic existence not as purity or perfection, but as active engagement with the world despite uncertainty. A meaningful life is built through participation, through struggle, through refusing to surrender one's freedom entirely even when circumstances are limiting or painful. As her thought expands further, it becomes clear that she sees liberation not as the achievement of a final harmonious state, but as an ongoing process of becoming, where individuals and societies continuously confront inherited structures, internal fears, and new forms of domination. Freedom remains fragile because human beings constantly face the temptation to escape into comfort, conformity, or fixed identities. Yet the possibility of transcendence never disappears completely, so long as consciousness remains capable of questioning itself and imagining different ways of living. As her philosophy deepens further, she begins to examine more closely the emotional and existential consequences of living within a society that constantly defines human value through external standards, because she understands that oppression is not sustained only through obvious domination, but through subtle psychological processes that shape desire itself, influencing what people believe they should want, admire, fear, or become. And in this way, individuals often participate unknowingly in maintaining the very structures that restrict them, adapting themselves to expectations so thoroughly that imposed limitations begin to feel like personal choices. She becomes especially attentive to the role of culture in this process, recognizing that literature, religion, media, education, romance, and mythology all contribute to constructing images of ideal femininity and ideal masculinity that narrow the possibilities of human existence. These images appear everywhere, repeated so constantly that they begin to feel natural, and because they are absorbed from childhood onward, many people rarely pause to question them deeply. Individuals learn how to perform gender before they fully understand themselves, gradually internalizing behaviors and desires shaped by social approval rather than authentic freedom. What troubles her is that these cultural myths often encourage women toward immanence rather than transcendence, toward a life enclosed within repetition, passivity, waiting, and service rather than outward movement into independent projects and creative action. Immanence refers to a condition where existence becomes trapped within maintenance and enclosure, where a person's life revolves around preserving routines or fulfilling predefined functions instead of actively shaping the world through freely chosen goals. She does not deny the importance of caregiving, relationships, motherhood, or domestic life, but she rejects the idea that these alone should define an entire existence. Human beings require the ability to move outward toward the future, toward projects that express individuality and creativity. And when entire groups are systematically denied this movement, their humanity becomes constrained, reduced into narrow forms that suppress vast dimensions of potential experience. At the same time, she understands that transcendence itself can become distorted when detached from ethical responsibility. Freedom pursued purely as domination over others ultimately betrays itself, because genuine liberation cannot exist within relationships built upon inequality and objectification. One person's freedom cannot fully flourish through the reduction of another into an instrument or possession. And this is why she insists that authentic human relationships must involve mutual recognition between free subjects rather than hierarchical dependence. Love, therefore, becomes deeply complicated within her philosophy, because desire often contains contradictory impulses. Individuals long to merge with others emotionally, while also preserving their own autonomy, and these desires can easily conflict. Many relationships become struggles for control disguised as romance, where one person attempts to secure certainty by limiting the freedom of the other, transforming love into possession rather than reciprocity. She rejects sentimental fantasies that portray love as complete self-sacrifice, because such surrender destroys individuality instead of enriching connection. Genuine intimacy requires two independent consciousnesses encountering one another without erasing difference. And this makes love difficult because it demands both closeness and separation simultaneously. To love authentically means accepting another person's freedom, even when that freedom introduces unpredictability, insecurity, and the possibility of loss. Her reflections on sexuality follow a similar path. She criticizes moral systems that treat sexuality either as shameful corruption or as purely biological instinct, because both approaches reduce the complexity of lived experience. Sexuality involves embodiment, vulnerability, imagination, social conditioning, emotional desire, and power all at once. And because society structures sexuality differently according to gender, individuals experience their bodies and desires through unequal frameworks shaped by expectation and judgment. She notices that women are often taught to experience their own bodies from an external perspective, becoming hyper-aware of appearance and desirability, while remaining disconnected from spontaneous embodiment itself. Instead of inhabiting the body naturally as an active center of experience, many learn to monitor themselves constantly through imagined observation, and this self-objectification fragments consciousness, dividing the self between lived experience and performed image. Her philosophy also confronts suffering directly. She does not believe existence can ever become entirely harmonious because conflict, limitation, aging, separation, failure, and mortality remain unavoidable features of the human condition. Yet she refuses nihilism because suffering alone does not erase meaning. Human beings create meaning through engagement with the world despite fragility and imperfection. Through relationships, projects, resistance, creativity, and commitment undertaken without absolute guarantees. This is why courage becomes so important in her thought. not heroic fearlessness, but the willingness to continue acting within uncertainty rather than retreating into passivity. Every authentic choice involves risk because no individual can fully predict consequences or secure permanent certainty. To exist freely, therefore, means accepting vulnerability instead of endlessly seeking shelter from it. She becomes increasingly critical of societies that encourage individuals to escape this vulnerability through distraction and consumption. Modern culture often offers endless entertainment, superficial aspiration, and repetitive routines that keep people occupied while preventing deeper confrontation with existence itself. And beneath constant activity, many individuals experience a quiet emptiness because they are moving continuously without truly choosing the direction of their lives. For her, authenticity does not mean discovering some hidden, fixed identity buried inside oneself. Human beings possess no final essence waiting to be uncovered. Authenticity means actively assuming responsibility for one's freedom, recognizing both the possibilities and limitations of existence without hiding behind excuses, deterministic myths, or socially imposed roles. It is a continual process rather than a permanent state. She also understands that liberation must remain collective as well as individual because isolated personal freedom cannot survive within fundamentally oppressive structures. Individuals influence one another constantly, and social conditions shape what kinds of choices become realistically available. This is why political and existential questions remain inseparable in her thought. Freedom requires transformation not only of consciousness, but also of material and cultural realities. As these reflections deepen, her philosophy increasingly becomes a defense of lived complexity itself against every system seeking to simplify human existence into rigid categories or predetermined destinies. Human beings remain contradictory creatures, simultaneously free and limited, embodied yet transcendent, vulnerable yet creative, shaped by history, yet capable of transforming it. And any philosophy that denies this ambiguity ultimately denies reality itself. And so her vision of existence continues moving toward a difficult but profoundly human conclusion. That meaning cannot be passively inherited or permanently secured, but must be created continuously through conscious engagement with the world and with others, through the ongoing effort to live freely without denying the freedom of those around us, and through the courage to remain open to becoming even within a reality that never offers certainty, stability, or completion. As her philosophy reaches its deepest and most complete form, everything begins to gather around the difficult truth that human existence can never become fully settled, pure, or complete, because to exist as a human being means to live within ambiguity permanently, suspended between freedom and limitation, independence and dependence, transcendence and vulnerability. And rather than trying to escape this condition through rigid identities or comforting illusions, she believes individuals must learn to confront it honestly, accepting the instability of existence as the very ground from which meaning emerges. She understands that much of human suffering comes from the desire to become fixed and secure, to escape uncertainty by turning oneself into something stable and unquestionable. Yet this desire ultimately conflicts with the nature of consciousness itself, because consciousness is movement, possibility, becoming. Human beings are never finished objects. They are always in the process of creating themselves through choices, actions, relationships, and projects unfolding through time, and every attempt to deny this openness leads toward stagnation, passivity, or domination. This is why she remains deeply suspicious of systems that assign predetermined destinies to individuals, whether through gender, class, religion, tradition, or ideology, because such systems reduce living consciousness into categories, treating people as things rather than as free beings capable of transformation. A society may appear orderly when everyone accepts prescribed roles, but beneath that order lies a quiet suffocation where countless possibilities remain unrealized, where individuals slowly abandon parts of themselves in exchange for recognition and security. For her, freedom is never comfortable because freedom demands responsibility. Every meaningful choice requires individuals to confront uncertainty without guarantees, and many people attempt to escape this burden by hiding behind social expectations, claiming they had no alternative, no power, no responsibility. But she refuses these excuses entirely. Circumstances shape existence profoundly, yet they never erase the necessity of choosing how to respond to those circumstances, and this unavoidable responsibility forms the core of human dignity as well as human anxiety. She also sees how easily societies encourage resignation. Individuals are taught to adapt, conform, perform, and survive within systems that often feel too large to challenge. And over time, many begin shrinking their aspirations, convincing themselves that freedom is unrealistic or dangerous, preferring the familiarity of repetition to the uncertainty of transformation. Yet beneath this adaptation, she senses a quiet dissatisfaction, a feeling that something essential has been surrendered whenever life becomes purely mechanical or externally defined. Against this passivity, she insists upon engagement with the world. Human beings do not discover meaning through withdrawal from existence, but through participation within it, through work, creation, relationships, struggle, thought, political action, love, and the continuous movement toward possibilities not yet realized. Meaning is not waiting somewhere outside life as a final answer to be found. It emerges through lived experience itself, through the active process of becoming. She returns again to the importance of reciprocity because no individual can achieve authentic freedom alone. Human existence is relational from the beginning. People require recognition from others in order to develop themselves fully. Yet this recognition must occur between equals rather than through domination. Whenever one person treats another merely as an object, instrument, or possession, both lives become diminished because the possibility of genuine mutual freedom disappears. This is why liberation remains inseparable from ethics in her philosophy. To will one's own freedom genuinely also means willing the freedom of others, since a world built upon oppression ultimately traps everyone within distorted relationships shaped by fear, dependence, and inequality. Ethical life, therefore, requires more than obedience to rules. It demands an active commitment to creating conditions where human beings can exist as free subjects rather than passive objects. She also recognizes that such a commitment is never simple because existence itself contains unavoidable conflict. Human beings pursue different desires, different projects, different visions of life, and no final harmony can permanently eliminate tension or contradiction. Yet rather than viewing this as failure, she sees conflict as part of the vitality of existence. A living world remains unfinished, open, dynamic, constantly reshaped through interaction between freedoms encountering one another. Mortality gives this entire struggle its urgency. Human life remains finite. Time passes irreversibly. Opportunities disappear. People age. Relationships change, bodies weaken, and death eventually interrupts every project. And because of this finitude, existence can never be postponed indefinitely. Individuals must decide whether they will truly live or merely drift through routines designed to avoid confronting themselves. Yet she does not respond to mortality with despair, because impermanence itself makes freedom meaningful. A life without limitation would contain no real choice, no risk, no commitment, no urgency. It is precisely because existence remains fragile and temporary that actions matter, that love matters, that creativity matters, and that every moment of authentic engagement carries significance beyond mechanical survival. In the end, her philosophy refuses both pessimism and false optimism. She does not believe history inevitably progresses toward justice, nor does she believe humanity is doomed to permanent oppression and emptiness. Instead, she places responsibility back into human hands, insisting that every generation participates in shaping the conditions under which freedom either expands or collapses. And this participation occurs not only through dramatic revolutions, but through everyday choices, relationships, cultural values, political structures, and acts of courage or surrender repeated across ordinary life. What remains after all her reflections is a vision of human existence that is demanding but profoundly alive. To live authentically means refusing to become passive matter shaped entirely by external forces. It means embracing ambiguity without surrendering to nihilism, accepting vulnerability without abandoning freedom, and engaging with others without reducing them into objects for one's own security or desire. And so her philosophy leaves behind neither a perfect system nor a final certainty, but an invitation to live consciously within the unfinished movement of existence itself, to recognize that human beings are never completely defined by what the world has made of them, because they continue, even under limitation, to possess the fragile but transformative capacity to choose, to create, to resist, to love, and to become something more than what they were told they must be. There are certain philosophers who do not simply challenge society. They challenge the hidden stories people tell themselves every day without even realizing it. Simone de Beauvoir was one of those thinkers. Once you truly understand her, ordinary life begins to look different. Relationships feel different. Gender feels different. Freedom feels heavier. Even the way people speak, love, obey, sacrifice, and build identities begins to reveal invisible structures that most human beings spend their entire lives unconsciously trapped inside. What made Beauvoir so powerful was not merely that she argued women were oppressed. Many people had said that before her. What made her dangerous was that she exposed how deeply society shapes human identity from childhood onward, until individuals begin mistaking social conditioning for natural reality itself. And once that realization enters the mind, it becomes impossible to fully return to innocence, because Beauvoir forces an unsettling question into the center of existence. How much of what people call human nature is actually constructed by society? How many desires, fears, ambitions, and limitations are genuinely ours? And how many were quietly placed inside us long before we became conscious enough to question them? She was born in Paris in 1908 into a conservative Catholic family that valued respectability, discipline, and traditional social order. At first glance, her childhood appeared stable and privileged compared to the chaos many Europeans would later experience during the 20th century. But beneath the surface, Beauvoir grew up inside a world filled with invisible expectations about what a woman was supposed to become. From a young age, she sensed that boys and girls were treated differently not only socially, but existentially. Boys were encouraged to imagine themselves as individuals destined to shape the world. Their ambitions were taken seriously. Their independence was expected. Their futures seemed open. Girls, meanwhile, were often prepared for something narrower and more passive. Their value became tied to appearance, obedience, desirability, marriage, motherhood, and social acceptance. Even intelligent women were subtly taught that their existence should orbit around others rather than around their own self-created purpose. This tension would later become central to Beauvoir's philosophy because she realized oppression does not always operate through obvious force alone. Sometimes it operates psychologically. Social expectations become internal voices. People absorb roles so deeply that they begin experiencing them as natural parts of themselves. And this process begins early. Children learn how to exist long before they fully understand what society is doing to them. They absorb gestures, fears, desires, ambitions, and limitations from the world around them almost unconsciously. Beauvoir became fascinated by how identity itself is slowly constructed through countless invisible pressures. As she grew older, she displayed extraordinary intellectual ability and an intense hunger for independence. Unlike many women of her time, Beauvoir refused to accept the idea that her life should revolve solely around marriage or domestic expectations. She wanted thought, freedom, intellectual seriousness. She wanted access to the same existential possibilities men had long claimed for themselves. This desire placed her in conflict with many cultural norms surrounding femininity at the time. Society often punishes women who appear too intellectually ambitious because independent women threaten traditional structures of power and expectation. Beauvoir understood this tension personally. A woman seeking autonomy was often perceived not as fully human in her own right, but as socially disruptive. And this revealed something important to her. Society frequently encourages women to become objects in the eyes of others rather than fully self-determining subjects of their own existence. This idea would later become one of the foundations of her philosophy. At university, Beauvoir entered intellectual circles dominated largely by men, where philosophy was treated as one of the highest forms of human achievement. It was there that she met Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher who would become her lifelong intellectual companion and one of the most influential relationships of her life. Together, they explored existentialism, a philosophy deeply concerned with freedom, responsibility, meaning, and the terrifying openness of human existence. Existentialism begins from a psychologically unsettling idea. Human beings are not born with fixed meaning already built into them. There is no guaranteed script waiting to tell people exactly who they are supposed to become. Instead, individuals are thrown into existence first, and only afterward begin shaping themselves through choices, actions, relationships, and commitments. This freedom sounds liberating at first, but Beauvoir understood its darker side immediately. Freedom is frightening. To be truly free means there is no permanent shelter from responsibility. Every choice shapes identity. Every action reveals values. Human beings constantly participate in creating themselves whether they fully realize it or not. And many people try desperately to escape this burden. Some hide inside religion, social conformity, nationalism, rigid gender roles, or collective identities because uncertainty feels emotionally unbearable. Fixed roles provide safety, predictability, a script to follow. Beauvoir became increasingly aware that women throughout history had often been denied the full existential freedom men were encouraged to pursue. Society treated men as independent actors while treating women as supporting figures whose purpose was defined relationally through fathers, husbands, children, or male approval. Women were not always encouraged to become fully autonomous selves. They were often taught instead to become desirable reflections for others. This realization slowly pushed Simone de Beauvoir toward the work that would make her one of the most influential philosophers of the modern world. She began examining not only political inequality between men and women, but the deeper psychological structures beneath it. She wanted to understand how entire societies shape consciousness itself, how human beings learn roles so deeply that those roles begin to feel natural, inevitable, even biological. And this led her toward one of the most famous and controversial ideas she would ever express. A woman is not simply born, but becomes one. What Beauvoir meant by this was far more profound than many people first assumed. She was not denying biological differences between sexes. She was arguing that society builds enormous layers of meaning, expectation, behavior, and identity on top of biology until individuals begin confusing social conditioning with destiny. From childhood onward, girls and boys are often guided into entirely different emotional worlds. Boys are frequently rewarded for independence, confidence, risk-taking, ambition, and self-assertion. They are encouraged to move outward into the world, to compete, to act, to dominate space socially and psychologically. Girls, meanwhile, are often shaped toward caution, attractiveness, agreeability, emotional caretaking, self-surveillance, and social acceptance. They learn very early that being liked can become tied to safety and value. Many begin monitoring themselves constantly through the imagined eyes of others. Beauvoir understood that this process affects consciousness at a deep level. A person who spends years being treated as an object of observation slowly begins observing themselves from the outside as well. This creates a divided existence. Instead of simply living freely and spontaneously, many individuals become trapped performing versions of themselves designed to meet social expectations. They monitor their bodies, their speech, their emotions, their aging, their desirability, their social acceptability. The self becomes something managed rather than fully lived. Beauvoir believed women were especially pressured into this condition because patriarchal societies historically encouraged women to derive identity from how they appeared to others rather than from their own independent projects and ambitions. This did not mean women lacked intelligence, strength, or creativity. Quite the opposite. Beauvoir believed countless human possibilities had been psychologically restricted by social systems, teaching women to shrink themselves inwardly before they ever had the chance to fully discover who they might become. And perhaps most disturbing of all, these systems often reproduce themselves quietly through ordinary daily life. Not always through explicit cruelty or obvious oppression, but through habits, expectations, media, traditions, family structures, romantic ideals, beauty standards, and emotional conditioning repeated generation after generation until they begin feeling invisible. This was why Beauvoir's philosophy felt so psychologically powerful. She was not merely criticizing laws or institutions. She was exposing hidden structures shaping the human mind itself. She also understood something painful about freedom. Many people fear it even while claiming to desire it, because genuine freedom comes with uncertainty, responsibility, and risk. A fully free individual cannot completely hide behind predetermined roles or social scripts. They must confront the frightening reality that life has no guaranteed blueprint. And this is exhausting. Beauvoir noticed that many human relationships become distorted by attempts to escape existential insecurity. People cling to one another not out of genuine love, but out of fear, dependency, validation, loneliness, or the desire to stabilize fragile identities. Instead of two free individuals meeting authentically, relationships can become subtle power struggles where each person tries to secure emotional certainty through the other. She was especially critical of romantic myths, teaching women that fulfillment would arrive primarily through male approval or sacrifice. Society often glorified women who dissolved themselves completely into relationships while treating female ambition or independence as threatening, selfish, or unfeminine. But Beauvoir believed this kind of self-erasure damaged both women and men. A healthy relationship, in her view, could only exist between two individuals who recognized one another as fully human subjects rather than possessions, roles, or emotional dependencies. Love should not require the destruction of freedom. This idea made many people uncomfortable because it challenged deeply rooted fantasies surrounding romance and gender. Beauvoir consistently forced readers to confront uncomfortable truths about how power operates invisibly through emotional life itself. Even intimacy, desire, beauty, marriage, and family structures could contain hidden forms of domination and expectation. And yet her philosophy was never simply cynical. At its core was a profound belief in human possibility. She believed individuals are never completely trapped by social conditioning. Human beings always retain some capacity to reflect, resist, choose, and redefine themselves even inside restrictive systems. Freedom may be difficult and frightening, but it is never entirely erased. This was why Beauvoir valued intellectual honesty so intensely. She believed many forms of suffering become invisible because societies normalize them. People adapt psychologically to limitations until they stop questioning them altogether. Philosophy, for her, was a way of waking people up to realities hidden beneath ordinary life. As Simone de Beauvoir grew older, her philosophy became increasingly tied to the emotional realities of everyday existence rather than abstract theory alone. She understood that oppression is not experienced only through laws or institutions. It is experienced internally through shame, insecurity, self-doubt, fear of rejection, economic dependence, loneliness, aging, and the exhausting pressure to perform socially acceptable identities. This was one reason her writing affected so many readers so deeply. People recognized themselves inside it. Beauvoir had an unusual ability to describe psychological experiences many individuals felt privately but struggled to articulate. The feeling of shrinking oneself to remain desirable. The feeling of living according to expectations that were never consciously chosen. The quiet resentment that grows when a person sacrifices too much of themselves for social approval. The strange emptiness that can appear when someone spends years performing roles while losing connection to their authentic desires. She believed modern society often teaches people to fear authenticity because authenticity disrupts social order. A person who truly begins questioning inherited expectations becomes unpredictable. They may reject traditional roles, challenge authority, leave unhealthy relationships, pursue forbidden ambitions, or redefine themselves entirely. And this possibility unsettles societies built upon stability and conformity. Beauvoir also became increasingly interested in aging and mortality, especially the way modern cultures treat aging women almost like social invisibility. She noticed that societies obsessed with youth and beauty often reduce women's value to desirability, creating deep psychological anxiety around time itself. Many women are taught from an early age to experience their bodies as objects constantly judged by others, which can create lifelong insecurity and alienation from the self. To Beauvoir, this revealed another tragic dimension of human existence. People frequently become trapped seeing themselves through external eyes instead of inhabiting their own lives freely from within. This externalization damages the spirit slowly. A person begins living not according to genuine inner experience, but according to anticipated judgment. They become fragmented between who they are and who they believe they must appear to be. Yet, Beauvoir never argued that freedom meant total independence from others. Human beings are deeply relational creatures shaped by society from birth onward. The challenge was not escaping human connection, but building relationships that preserve dignity and mutual freedom rather than domination or dependence. She believed the highest form of human relationship occurs when two individuals recognize each other as equally real, equally conscious, equally free. Not as roles, not as possessions, not as emotional tools for validation, but as separate human beings sharing existence together without trying to imprison one another psychologically. This vision of freedom was demanding because it required maturity, honesty, and self-awareness. It required people to confront their own insecurities instead of controlling others to avoid fear and loneliness. And perhaps this was Beauvoir's deepest message beneath all her philosophy. Human beings often participate in their own limitations because freedom itself is frightening. To live authentically means accepting uncertainty, responsibility, and the possibility of failure. It means becoming the author of one's life rather than merely inheriting an identity from society. Most people sense this possibility somewhere deep inside themselves, which is why Beauvoir's work continues to resonate generations later. She was not simply writing about women alone. She was writing about what it means for any human being to struggle against invisible forces shaping the self. And she believed that despite all social pressure, despite all conditioning, despite all fear, human beings still possess the ability to wake up, question the roles imposed upon them, and begin becoming something more conscious and free. In the final decades of her life, Simone de Beauvoir became something larger than a philosopher. She became a symbol of intellectual independence itself. Around the world, countless people encountered her work during moments of private confusion and suddenly found language for feelings they had carried silently for years. Women questioning their roles, men questioning power and masculinity, individuals struggling with identity, love, dependency, aging, ambition, loneliness, and freedom. Beauvoir seemed to speak directly to the hidden tension between the life society expects and the life a human being secretly longs to live. What made her philosophy endure was that it never remained purely theoretical. It reached directly into ordinary experience, into relationships, into the body, into insecurity, into daily routines people rarely examine closely enough. She understood that many human beings move through life half asleep socially. They inherit assumptions about gender, success, romance, beauty, morality, and purpose without fully asking where those assumptions came from. Entire identities can be constructed from expectations absorbed unconsciously since childhood. And because these structures feel familiar, they become difficult to see. This was one of Beauvoir's greatest strengths as a thinker. She made the invisible visible. She exposed how power often survives not only through force, but through normalization, through repetition, through stories repeated so often they begin feeling natural. A society does not always need chains to limit people. Sometimes expectations are enough. Fear of rejection is enough. Fear of loneliness is enough. Fear of becoming socially undesirable is enough. Many individuals imprison themselves long before anyone else needs to. Beauvoir believed this was especially true for women living inside cultures that constantly taught them to evaluate themselves from the outside, to monitor their appearance, desirability, behavior, aging, and emotional acceptability almost endlessly. Under these pressures, many women became disconnected from their own desires and ambitions because so much psychological energy was spent adapting themselves to external judgment. But Beauvoir also believed these patterns harmed men in different ways. Societies often pressured men into emotional suppression, dominance, competition, and rigid ideas of strength. Vulnerability became shameful. Dependence became weakness. Emotional intimacy became difficult. Many men learned to fear tenderness within themselves because masculinity was tied so heavily to control and performance. In this sense, Beauvoir saw gender roles as limiting the humanity of everyone involved. People became trapped performing identities rather than living authentically. Relationships became shaped by power and expectation rather than mutual recognition. Individuals searched for meaning through status, romance, beauty, approval, or control while remaining inwardly uncertain about who they truly were. And beneath all of this remained the existential condition Beauvoir never stopped confronting. Human beings are free, but frightened by freedom. This tension sits at the center of modern life. People long for individuality while also craving social belonging. They want authenticity while fearing rejection. They desire freedom while searching desperately for certainty. Much of human behavior emerges from this conflict. Beauvoir believed many social systems survive precisely because they relieve individuals from the anxiety of creating themselves independently. Fixed roles provide emotional stability. They tell people who to become, how to behave, what to value, and what kind of life will be socially rewarded. But there is a cost to living entirely through inherited scripts. A person may gain acceptance while slowly losing contact with their deeper self. This is why Beauvoir valued self-awareness so intensely. She wanted individuals to examine the forces shaping them rather than unconsciously obeying them. Not because she believed freedom was easy or comfortable, but because unconscious existence leads to a quieter form of suffering. A life lived according to expectations that never truly belonged to you. Yet Beauvoir was never naive about how difficult freedom can be. She knew economic realities, social structures, emotional conditioning, and cultural pressures deeply influence human possibilities. Not everyone begins life with equal opportunities for autonomy. Some individuals carry enormous burdens imposed by society long before they are capable of resisting them. Still, she refused fatalism. She believed human beings always retain some possibility for reflection and transformation. Even small acts of awareness matter. The moment a person begins questioning inherited assumptions, something shifts internally. The world no longer feels completely fixed. New possibilities begin emerging where certainty once existed. And perhaps that is why Simone de Beauvoir continues to feel so alive today. Because modern society still struggles with many of the tensions she explored. People still battle insecurity shaped by impossible standards. Still confuse performance with identity. Still search for meaning inside systems rewarding conformity. Still fear loneliness enough to betray parts of themselves for acceptance. Her philosophy remains powerful because it does not simply accuse society. It asks individuals to confront themselves honestly, to ask whether they're truly living consciously or merely repeating roles handed to them by culture, fear, and expectation, to ask whether their desires are genuinely theirs, to ask whether love in their lives is rooted in freedom or dependency, to ask whether they are becoming fully human or slowly disappearing beneath performance. And in the end, Beauvoir leaves behind neither comforting optimism nor hopeless despair. She leaves a challenge: to become awake enough to recognize the invisible forces shaping your existence, and courageous enough to begin deciding who you will become beyond them.